Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. Tens of thousands have taken to the streets in Prague in the largest anti-government protest since 2019, targeting Prime Minister Andrej Babiš over concerns about defense policy, democratic standards, and the country's direction. Joining us today on TVP World to assess what's driving the unrest is Ján Michalčák, former head of unit for countering hybrid threats at the Czech Defense Ministry, an expert in disinformation and security threats across Central Europe. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Pleasure to be here, as always.
Right, so we're looking at this protest and the turnout is quite impressive. What is driving such a large turnout at this moment?
You're right, completely. As you said, it is the largest protest since 2019, and coincidentally, that protest back in 2019 was also against a government of led by Andrej Babiš at the time. But this time, I would say it's a combination of three factors that led people to the streets in such massive numbers. First, we have to realize that Andrej Babiš came back to power with one very specific goal, and which he makes no secret of, and that is to keep his immunity. Because in Czechia, politicians are protected from any sort of criminal prosecution as long as the House, the Parliament, doesn't lift the immunity. And so Babiš made it no secret when he was building his new coalition that keeping his immunity, in other words, not having the required majority of MPs voting to lift it, is what is his primary goal. And that was number one. And of course, having top politicians shielded from prosecution. Just shortly, Babiš is being prosecuted in a case of a fraud of EU funds amounting to over 2 million euros. And as the highest court in Czechia concluded, he would have been most likely found guilty had his immunity been lifted. But this was prevented by his new coalition. So that was number one. Number two is the fact that the government is now preparing its own version of the so-called foreign agent law, which they claim is built on the example of the US FARA law, but in fact is so vague that it would target basically anyone dealing in any capacity with the abroad, with the Western world, so because it would have required NGOs and any individual having any sort of business contacts to with abroad entities to sign up with the government. And third, lastly, it is the government's plan to basically nationalize the public service television in Czechia. All three factors combined basically mean that 250,000 people, as it seems, took to the streets yesterday.
Right, like mentioned, the last time we saw such a large-scale protest was back in 2019, and it's also under Andrej Babiš as well. But that brings us to the question, how much of this is more grassroots mobilization versus more opposition-led activism? We know that the election only took place not long ago, and he's fresh off the election. He was voted in 3 months ago. And how much of it is this actually political?
That's a great question. And of course, unsurprisingly, the government is now trying to frame the protests as the opposition not being willing to accept the result of the election. But it has to be said that the NGO actually behind the protests is strictly apolitical. That doesn't mean, of course, that the opposition parties are not trying to use it to their advantage now, which they are. But the people behind the protests are strictly apolitical and have always been. And they claim that their main intent is to protect democracy and, as they say, protect the democratic backsliding in Czechia that will be similar to what we've seen in Hungary and in the not so recent past under the previous Polish government. So that's the claims. Of course, depends on which side you're on, but the fact of the matter is that the NGO itself is apolitical. There's not a single politician being in executive functions in the NGO that would be in any way, shape, or form connected to any sort of political party in Czechia.
Right, but again, he was voted in 3 months ago, so wouldn't that be an argument for democracy that having him implementing his stated policies in the first place would be more in line with the idea of democracy as opposed to what the protesters are now asking?
Of course. And last time I checked, the protests have been extremely peaceful. Yes, large numbers took to the streets, but there is no one physically preventing the government of Andrej Babiš to actually implement the policies that they want to implement. But one of the biggest prerogatives in a democracy that is actually functioning is allowing people to voice their disagreements with the government, which now people have been doing. And, if you look at it critically, some of the proposed legislation, for example, the so-called foreign agent law, is so vaguely written that it really could pose a danger to Czech democracy and to the status and well-being of NGOs and people dealing with outside entities in any way. And even the ANO party of Andrej Babiš admitted yesterday that the shape in which the legislation has been proposed is not perfect and that it has to be reworked. They still claim that they want to introduce the so-called foreign agent law, and as you rightly pointed out, they have won the election and they do have the majority. So if they want to implement it, they will be able to, barring any sort of unforeseen circumstances. But Czechs have traditionally been very peaceful protesters, so I don't see any escalation on the horizon. As I said, if the government is really keen on implementing the legislation, even in the face of the opposition, which is immense, they will be able to do it. But one factor that we shouldn't forget is the fact that Czechia, unlike, for example, Slovakia, does have a second chamber in parliament, the Senate, which means that should the government be intent on pushing through any sort of constitutional amendments or amendments to the election law, for example, they would need agreement of the Senate as well. And as it stands, the Senate is purely governed by the opposition forces in the lower chamber. So Babiš will not be able to push through any sort of groundbreaking changes to the constitution or election laws for now. That said, Czechia faces a Senate election later this year, and according to the latest polls, ANO could be successful in the Senate election as well. So far, they haven't seen any large success in the Senate because the way that the system is built basically means that the opposition, whatever it is at the moment, of the lower chamber is always more likely to win a Senate election. But ANO has been making gains in the polls, so we'll see what happens in, say, 2 years' time. But for now, at least, any sort of groundbreaking changes that would really endanger the democratic course and well-being in Czechia, I think, are not very likely, just due to the fact that we have a Senate that is opposed to any sweeping changes.
Right, so it does seem like the check and balance is working as intended, at least for the time being, but no pun intended. Now, there's also speculations about potential foreign actors amplifying divisions. Can you help us understand a little bit about that part?
Sure. We've seen foreign actors being interested in sowing chaos, not only in the Czech Republic, but also in the EU in general. And just 2 days ago, we've seen the news of an ammunition company, ammunition depot, being set on fire in the Czech town of Pardubice. And the ammunition company had been producing ammo for basically all the major conflicts that the world has seen in the recent years, be it Ukraine or Israel. And it is not yet clear who exactly is behind the attack, but the authorities agree, including the government, that all versions of why the attack happened agree on one simple fact, and that is that it was intentional and it was caused by a foreign power. As it stands, we don't know if it was Russia or maybe pro-Iranian forces or someone completely different, but it is clear and it confirms yet again that Czechia is as well and has been a clear target of foreign malign actors, be it Russia or Iran or others, or China, of course, that want to destabilize the country and take it off course, for example, off the course of supporting Ukraine further. Bringing back to Babish and his government, he has made clear that Ukraine and foreign policy is not a priority for him. He said that he will side with Slovakia and Hungary in basically stopping all ammunition aid to Ukraine. He said that there will be not a single penny from the state budget going to further support of Ukraine, but ammunition companies and private businesses have been really active. And Czechia is one of the major countries in Europe producing ammunition for all parties that are interested to buy it. We have major ammunition companies. And so that logically means that no matter what the government thinks and declares they want to do or don't want to do, private businesses still operate. And that means that malign actors want to stop it in any way or shape or form. And just 2 days ago, the way they chose to do it was to set the whole company and the ammunition depot ablaze.
Right, and this does paint a stark contrast compared to the previous administration, where the Czech is considered one of the staunchest supporter of Ukraine when it comes to ammunition. Now, how has that been perceived within the country? You mentioned Babiš making it very clear that it wants to diminish the support to Ukraine. Did that help him in the previous round of elections, and has it become a hot-button issue at the time being?
I think so. Unfortunately, I think for the country, yes, it has been a major issue in the recent election. But one thing for your viewers to understand is that Andrej Babiš, unlike, for example, Robert Fico in Slovakia or Viktor Orbán in Hungary, Andrej Babiš is not driven by ideology at all. His main interest is pure and hard pragmatism. For example, as I mentioned at the beginning, his pragmatic goal number one was quite simply not to go to jail. And that was why he built a coalition such as he did. And the coalition is now composed of parties that would have been strictly off limits to any sensible government just, 5 years ago. He governs with a far-right party that the courts ruled, and I'm not exaggerating here, the Czech courts ruled that the party can be freely labeled fascist for what it stands for. So I can freely say it because that's a court decision. That's one of the coalition partners of Andrej Babiš. And the second one is a right-wing party opposed to scientific consensus on climate change, for example, the motorists. And combined, it is a strictly Eurosceptic and Ukraine-skeptic country. Just to paint you a picture, a representative of the fascist party, the SPD, is now the country's Minister of Defense. Of course, the Ministry of Defense is the body, the ministry coordinating our help to Ukraine. And as for the society is strictly divided, fragmented, which is, again, not unique for Czechia, I think. Unfortunately, we've been seeing it elsewhere as well. For Babiš, it seems that at least 30% of the electorate are his core, and the 30% will always take him to power the way it stands. Himself, Babiš, I don't think he's, strictly anti-Ukraine or pro-Ukraine. He just does whatever guarantees his success in the election, and his impunity. And as it stands, unfortunately, that means that he, again, also personally has to lean in to the more Eurosceptic side, to the more Ukrainian skeptic side, and he has to suffer through with heavily problematic and questionable people in positions of power, such as the fascist party and its ministers, because that's what he needs to stay in power. It's heavily pragmatic. It doesn't bring benefits to the country, unfortunately, but it does bring benefits to Babiš himself.
Right, and I think the protests are highlighting it's just that. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it, and thanks for being with us on TVP World.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you for tuning into this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.